Well, welcome to another episode. So glad you joined us today. And as always, I never take for granted that your time is valuable and really appreciate when you choose to spend it here with us. And because of that, I always strive to make sure you get really good value. So today, as I sometimes say, get your pad and pens or laptops or whatever ready, because I think this is a subject you're not going to want to miss. We're talking today with Michael Cannivet about negotiating your financial security through story, which is something I feel very passionately about. So welcome, Michael. It's so good to have you here.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
And for those who may not know him, Michael Cannivet, he's a Chartered Financial Analyst. He's a graduate of Georgetown University, and he's the founder, president, and chief investment officer of Silverlight Asset Management. And he's also a Forbes contributor. He's author of the 4-Minute Retirement Plan. So he's got lots of chops behind us to talk about this topic and give us lots of value today. So, Michael, how do you come to coach clients on their financial future? Like what inspired that particular career path for you?
Sure. Well, I'm more of an investment manager by training. I was an equity analyst in a previous life at a big firm, and then I went and joined a smaller investment firm where I got to work more directly with clients again. So I was still managing their money. I was the chief investment officer, but I've worked directly with clients a lot off and on throughout my career. And then when I started my own firm, it's been more of the same. So I think what I try to do is I look at the markets in a systematic way. I'm an active investor, which means I try to find things that are going to do better than other things and manage risk within certain parameters along the way, not just by passive index funds like the S&P 500, which is a fine approach, but I do the research. And in learning how to research the complexities of the capital markets, I think I learned how to apply some of the same lessons I learned from that to helping us manage the complexity of our lives.
Yeah.
And that's the real reason I wrote the book. I'm not a retirement planning specialist by trade, but it is the number one financial goal that gives people the most stress.
Yeah.
And I think it's the most complex challenge over the longest period of time. So I want to take what's worked well for me as an investor and try to use that same process to deconstruct what I call the retirement race into manageable laps that people can execute one at a time and feel good about.
I like that. That's a nice approach. And one of the things that really attracted me, and the reason I wanted to definitely get you on in here, you've got this unique approach to finance where you centered around empowering stories. And I'm a big fan of that. This podcast is the art of feminine negotiation. I think a big part of effective negotiation is that rapport building, relationship building, and often do it through stories. Certainly as a litigator, I would call in stories about my kids and you name it to be more powerful and humanize the approach. So tell us about your approach with the empowering stories.
Sure. Well, I think it's really easy to get off track with your finances if you're not really clear with yourself and other people about what it is that you truly want. So, and sometimes you got to negotiate with yourself and others on these fronts, because one thing that I write about in the book is if you want to have an empowering story behind your financial plan, which I really think is the key foundation, because you can work with a financial advisor, spend a ton of time watching CNBC, but if you don't have inspiring goals that get you excited to wake up in the morning and go out and work hard to fund that, then you don't have that emotional magnet that you need to keep following through and doing the right things. People are surprisingly disconnected from their future selves. We think of our future self 15 years in the future almost like a distant stranger. And one of the things I talk about in the book is you want to be your own future best friend. And you want to do things that are wise today to fund that lifestyle legacy that you want tomorrow. But you got to have something that connects the dots between today and tomorrow and the next day, because we're all managing so many things in such short time intervals. It's easy to get off track. So the first third of my book is not about numbers. It's all about narrative, because I think if you get the narrative right, it's a lot easier to get the numbers right. That's actually not the hard part. One way to think about it is if you think what makes a great movie in Hollywood? Is it the finance department? Not really. No. It's the writers, the directors, and the actors. And in our own life, we are the writer, the actor, and the director of our life. But I think sometimes we get so caught up in acting in our life and reacting that we forget that we're the author and director of this show too. And our life is a story. That's how we think about it. We think about everything through stories. So if you use that in your profession, you're doing something smart there, in my opinion, because storytelling is one of the oldest things in humanity. We've used stories to connect to each other and teach each other lessons for thousands of years. I think that is a communication superpower that's underutilized in the financial field today. And that's why I want to teach people a constructive way to write a story about their life, to get better in touch with who they really are and who they really want to be in the future. So what are the ingredients of a good story? I think a few things. Core values. What are your core values? Meaning the things that define success in your mind. These are usually formed when we're kids because our brains are most impressionable when we're about 0 to 8.
Yeah, sadly.
And we have mentors in that time frame. They teach us things about what it means to be a successful adult someday. And those lessons never leave us. So I have some exercises in the book that help people peel the onion on what are your core values? How can you attach them to specific goals in the short term, medium term, and long term that inspire you? And then you can reverse engineer what it's going to take to fund that. Really, you got to just figure out how much do you need to save on average and what do you need to get as an average return on your investments. And you can model all that stuff or hire someone to do it for you if you want to work with a financial advisor. But the most important thing is to get your story straight first. And that takes some negotiation because sometimes our core values collide with each other.
Yeah.
And that makes it a more difficult situation where we have to choose between path A or path B. So you have to be clear about what your priorities are when you face those forks in the road.
Yeah. I love that approach, and it's just so refreshing. I mean, I can't think of an example where I've heard that in the context of finance, which is why I think so many people get intimidated by the whole process because the humanity's being stripped out of it. Now, can you give us like an example of a narrative when you're saying about you've got to get the narrative right? What would be an example of that just to make this more concrete for our listeners?
Sure. So one of the first examples I talk about in the book is a guy named Theodore Johnson. He used to work at UPS. He was a vice president, did okay, but never made more than $14,000 in a given year. Retired when he was in the 1950s when he retired. And he once upon a time had a negative story that he was telling himself that he couldn't get ahead because he couldn't save any money. And then he was telling his friend this one day, and his friend asked him a question that changed his life. He said, "What if you just pretend to tax yourself? If you're gonna, why not put yourself in front of Uncle Sam? You have to pay him, right? So just make it a rule in your mind that you're taxing yourself." And that, for whatever reason, just put the light bulb on in his mind, and it logically made sense. It emotionally made sense. And he followed through and he saved about 20% of his income every year, which he put into UPS stock. Now, I wouldn't recommend anybody put all their money into one company, especially the company they work for. There's a lot of risks with that. But he got pretty lucky because UPS did really well in the second half of the last century. And this man who only made $14,000 in a given year retired with, or when he died, his estate was worth $70 million.
Oh my gosh. Oh my God.
And this is a guy who started off with a negative story. He couldn't get ahead because he couldn't save. And reality is, if you have an income, anybody out there that has an income, if you follow something I talk about in my book called the 50-30-20 formula, you'll figure out how much you to put into your needs, wants, and let's say long-term savings. And that's about 20% is what you want to save for the long term, whether that be for retirement or long-term future goals. But that simple pie chart works, and it keeps you on track. It's just hard when there's inflation. There's a lot of negative things that are floating around about the economy on the news and stuff like that. But sometimes you just got to tune it out and come up with a better constructive story that resonates with you.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, we're seeing, for our listeners, I hope you're getting it, like story everywhere, a different narrative about the media that we're getting, that constant climate of fear, right? A different story. And this extends even beyond finance. I love when I allow myself to take a step back and get intentional about flipping the story when I've got negative ones. Growing up, I came from a really low rental apartment. We never had anything. Money was always an issue. I go to law school. Most of the people surrounding me all came with big contacts, and I had nothing, right? I was figuring out. And I used to have that as a story, a negative story. And then I flipped the story going, where I came from allowed me to be more human in my, I've got street smarts when I litigate. I've got grit. I've got all of this. So I love that. Now, we talked about, you had mentioned actually, Michael, mindset, right? And the idea concepts of this storytelling. How else? I'm a big believer that our first and most important negotiation is with ourselves, negotiating our mindset. Any other tips you have or thoughts on how we can negotiate, a stronger mindset to maximize our effectiveness in investing?
Yeah, definitely. Another part of creating a constructive story I write about is managing your time perspective. A lot of people don't know this, but we all live in different time zones at all times. Sometimes we're thinking in the past, and it could be positive or negative thoughts about the past. Sometimes we're in the present moment. we're enjoying ourselves. That would be called present hedonism. Or sometimes we're thinking about the future, and that can be positive or negative in our orientation.
Yeah.
And one of the things that happens over time is our time perspective changes, but we can actively manage it. And if we spend more time living in past positive, present hedonism, and future positive, we are not only going to be happier, but we're also going to be more successful. Conversely, some of us spend way too much time lamenting things that happened a long time ago in the past, and those are chains that prohibit us from moving forward in our life. So if you have a thought pattern in your head that it tends to gravitate towards past negative stories a lot, or what that probably does is it makes you more fearful about the future. That makes it harder to create compelling future goals that you believe will actually come true.
Yeah.
So the way you write your story is never to write anything about being a victim at any point in your life. And I learned this the hard way because I felt like a victim at one point in my life. I worked for 7 years with a partner. We grew the firm 500%. I was a top 1% equity manager for 4 years running. And he fired me unexpectedly one day because we didn't have a similar story about our succession plan.
Wow.
And I was shocked and hurt by that.
Of course.
But it was good in retrospect because we weren't really cut out to be partners because we didn't really have the same core values.
Yeah.
I was kind of ignoring that for a while. And now that I look back on it, I'm like, wow, he did me a favor that day, because now I started my company and I learned so much from that experience. But it was painful to go through. And everybody has something like that, right?
I was just thinking, been there, done that, don't appreciate it at the time, but I love, you've got to be able to get past it to tell a different story about it. What did I learn from it? How turn it into a success, right?
Yep, exactly. So I tell people, try to think of 3 times in your life when you felt most on track, happy, thriving, not only feeling good about where you were in that time in your life, but where you were going in your life. And when you think of, 3 different ages, let's say, where you did feel on track, and then you think of sometimes maybe 3 different times when you weren't on track, when you're really low, when things really didn't feel good and your optimism about the future kind of wasn't there. What you'll find oftentimes is you were living by your core values in the good times, and the bad times you kind of deviated from them unintentionally, because most of us don't walk around very well aware of what our core values are. But if you can link core values to how you live your life, and you can audit your thinking a little bit just by being aware that there's this thing called time perspective. There's actually an assessment you can take on Dr. Philip Zimbardo's website from his book about this subject. It only takes 10 minutes. It'll tell you how you score in your time perspective against the broad population. It'll tell you where you want to be for each time zone. And the great news is you can manage this. This is not set in stone. Once you're aware of it, you can take a lot of steps to redirect your story and live a better life. And then, figuring out the financial stuff is easy at that point, because you know exactly where you're going.
I love that perspective on time. Dan, what a great mindset shift, right? To be able to approach it about that positive past, positive future spin, present hedonistic. I've never heard that before, and I love it. Now, we talked about the fact that so many people are intimidated about finance and investing. I was going to ask you how we negotiate past that fear, but I assume part of that is the narrative that we're telling ourselves. Anything else you'd suggest on that?
Yeah, chunking. One of the reasons I wrote my book and called it the 4-Minute Retirement Plan is because it was inspired by the story of Roger Bannister.
Yes.
He ran the first 4-minute mile back in the 1950s, for those who don't know. And he actually passed away when I was going through that tough period of getting fired and contemplating my life. And I was really inspired by his story because I saw it as a comeback story.
Yeah.
And the way he came back was he ran in the Olympics, got 4th place, kind of a nothing burger. Most people thought he'd retire from running, and he was a 25-year-old student at Oxford Medical School. And even though he only had a half hour to train during his lunch breaks, he practiced running 59-second laps over and over and over again, because he decided he wasn't ready to retire from running on a down note. He wanted to do something everyone kept saying was impossible at the time, and that's running the first 4-minute mile. At the time, the record for a mile was 4 minutes and a second. It had been in place for 9 years. So people had these crazy theories because nobody could eclipse that mark. People thought maybe the human body's not designed to run that fast, or maybe you'll die if you try. And since he was going to be a physician, he knew it wasn't a physical limitation, it was a mental limitation. So what he did is he first had a positive story, and then he chunked down the race into manageable parts. 4 laps is a mile, 59 seconds a lap, I'll achieve my goal. And then he had pace runners on race day, and their job was only to run 59 seconds. One guy was in charge of the first 2 laps, the other guy was in charge of the last 2 laps. And if you watch that race, because there's video of it, he's kind of running just behind the leader most of the race. And only at the very end does he burst forward and leave them all in the dust. And that's not because he was running that much faster. It's because they all slowed down and ran out of gas. But he had the stamina because he had practice and he had figured out the race he wanted to run to achieve what he wanted to do. Financial stuff, especially long-term goals, it can be overwhelming. But you can chunk everything down. You can chunk your budget down into the 50-30-20 formula. That's a real simple way to think about how to allocate your money in a way that's going to serve you, not just now, but also in the future. When you're ready to retire, there's something called the 4% rule. If you just take 4% of your principal in year 1 and you adjust for inflation every year after, you have over a 95% chance of not running out of money in retirement. Is it a perfect formula? No. Is it darn good? Yes. And that's what I do in the book. I give people 48 strategies they can use to figure out where they want to go on the 4 laps of the retirement race, because I chunk that down too. There's a savings lap, an investing lap, a lifestyle lap, and a legacy lap. I contend if you neglect any of those 4, you're going to not really be totally fulfilled or happy. Because if you think about it, saving money is great, but if you invest it unwisely, that can go away. If you save money and you invest it well, but you don't live a better life as a result, what's the point? And then with your legacy, that's where a lot of the legal stuff comes in. But, planning your estate is not that difficult if you just do a few simple things. More than half of people don't even have a will in America when they die, which is a real shame, because that means a lot of their resources that they've accumulated throughout their life go to tax people and attorneys. Good for the attorneys, but not good for
I'm curious.
So everything's about chunking it down, because we're all busy people. We all want things simplified, and I think we all need more help with that.
Got so much packed in there. That's fantastic. And I love the Roger Bannister story. It's the power of belief, right? The fact that humans believe we weren't capable. And then shortly after, he did it almost immediately after Roger got the 4-minute mile. Tons of people do it now. High school students get it routinely, right? It's remarkable, that power of our mindset. Now, what do you find are the biggest mistakes most people make around finances?
They procrastinate because they have paralysis by analysis, or they just haphazardly jump from strategy or tactic to strategy or tactic based on, whoever seems most persuasive, in terms of whoever's in their ear. A lot of people are under equitized, meaning they don't own enough equities. If you've been scarred by a past market event, it's easy to kind of have too low of a risk profile in your portfolio. But if you're not getting enough growth in your portfolio, you might actually be shortchanging your long-term lifestyle and legacy, because you're not maximizing the best asset allocation relative to your time horizon. A lot of young people are even struggling with this. A lot of millennials and Gen Z, they don't believe they can get ahead by just investing in traditional stocks or bonds. So they turn to more exotic things like crypto, which I'm okay with Bitcoin, but some other stuff that is just not really for them. So I think, just you can make everything a lot easier on yourself if you have a story behind your plan that kind of is the compass. Because if you know what your goals are, you can figure out what you need to save and invest to get to those goals on time. And that's the best benchmark for success. It's not what your neighbor's portfolio is doing. It's not what Nvidia is doing, or any of the hot stocks that they get always talked about on financial media. What really matters is you and your goals, and getting there the smoothest way possible. And I think that's something we all, again, need help with.
Yeah, lots of gems there. And I know it's a touchy subject, but do you find in your experience there's any difference in the genders when it comes to investment?
Yeah, I wrote an article for Forbes a few years ago called "Why Women Are Better Investors Than Men." And the reason, I figured you'd like that one. And the reason is because men in study after study, we do about 1% or so worse per year than women do managing our portfolios. And the reason seems to be that we're more overconfident. The behavioral
Okay.
finance term is
I can
there's an
see that.
illusion of control. Men think the
Yeah.
more they trade, the better they're going to do, and women
Yeah.
are smart enough to know that that's not always the case, and they just
Yeah.
have a better emotional temperament. They don't trade as much, and by
Yeah.
doing less, they actually achieve more. So
That's
that's one thing worth knowing.
And
Yeah.
why are lottery winners more likely to go bankrupt? I saw that was one of the things that you had touched on.
Yeah. I tell a story about a man named Jack Whitaker. He was worth $14 million. He pulled up to a gas station on Christmas Eve one cold morning in West Virginia, and he only bought lottery tickets if it was a big prize. And he won the biggest prize ever that day. He won $314 million. And a few years later, he said to Time Magazine he wished he never bought the ticket because it ruined his life.
Wow.
And the reason is, he came into a lot of money fast, like a lot of people do. It changed his personality.
Yeah.
He drove around a Lamborghini throwing money out the window, and he was also the target of swindlers who tried to rob him and things like that. And
Yeah.
but the worst thing that happened was he spoiled his granddaughter with the money, and she became a drug addict and died.
Yeah.
And so he had just a lot of personal tragedies, and it's not that different than what you see. There's a lot of stories like that,
Yeah.
unfortunately. And
Yeah.
I think the reason is, like, winning the lottery, you're actually more likely to go bankrupt than someone who doesn't win the lottery, because it's more likely to lead to you having a lot of lifestyle changes that aren't really congruent with you. And this is where it gets back to the story. If you become past negative because something bad happens, if you become somebody who's not embodying your true core values,
Yeah.
you can have all the money in the world. It doesn't matter. You'll
Yeah.
spend it chasing happiness, but it never really sticks. So that's why I think it's important, whether we're millionaires or billionaires or just the average Joe next door, we can be happy and fulfilled if we know who we are, who we want to be, and we base our goals on that, and not the whims of, what's on social media or anything else.
Yeah, I get it's great. I hadn't thought of tying it to the the inconsistency with core values, but that makes perfect sense as you were saying it. So now you'd mentioned your book's called The 4 Minute Retirement Plan, and that obviously caught my attention. So can you tell us in a nugget what the elements are of that 4 minute retirement plan?
Yeah, sure. So there's four laps, like I mentioned, and then
Yeah.
if you go through those lap chapters, which is after the section of the book that teaches you how to write the story behind your plan,
Yeah.
you'll find at the end of every chapter four different strategies you can use to solve whatever the riddle is that we talked about in the chapter. So every chapter starts the same. I start with a story so you can understand the human elements involved with
Yeah.
these issues. They're not just esoteric, abstract concepts. These are real world issues I'm trying to focus on: how to save, how to invest wisely, how to build your lifestyle the way you want it, etc. And then, so I challenge everybody at the end of every chapter to take no more than 20 seconds to figure out which of these strategies for you, check the box and move on. Because the number one thing that stifles people is the paralysis by analysis.
Yes.
Like, this guy sounds persuasive, she sounds persuasive,
Yeah.
who do I listen to? And then they just bob and weave and bob and weave, and they never really get anywhere. So if you take 20 seconds to do for those 12 chapters, you'll be able to create a 4 minute plan. And it shouldn't
Awesome.
take any more than that, because even if you don't read the chapters, okay, you can just pick any of the strategies. They're all time tested to work. And if you
Yeah.
cover the bases on all four laps with reasonably good strategies, it doesn't matter which strategies you choose, you will do
Yeah.
better than most people.
And you're trusting your intuition, which I think we've gone so far away from that. Forcing to do it in 20 seconds taps into something elemental, right? So that you're having that reaction. I think that's brilliant. Do you have any shortcuts you could share with us for how, for our listeners who feel like they are off track right now, any shortcuts for how they can get on track financially right now?
50-30-20 budget formula is my number one, because that's the easiest way to start
Yeah.
saving. Make sure you're maximizing your tax deferred savings vehicles as the first priority for how you save. Make sure you have an emergency savings account of 6 to 12 months of your expenses. You can do that in cash or cash equivalents, so it's low risk, or you could put it in something I call a scarcity fund, which would be like collectibles or rare things that you enjoy owning that will retain value over time. And it's important to have that in case something unexpected comes out of left field. Like when I got fired, I was glad I had emergency savings, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you never know when you're gonna need that money. So it's an important thing. Once you have those bases covered, I would say, try to focus on mostly being in equities while you're young. There's no easy shortcut on how you can dial in your asset allocation at every age. But I'm not a big fan of the target date funds that a lot of people have in their 401ks. those all invest in passive vehicles like the S&P 500, which are getting really, really crowded because too many people are buying those things. Everyone's putting all their money in Microsoft, Apple, and Nvidia, independent of what the fundamentals are. And that's a dangerous thing long term, because any time in history that the really biggest companies have been a lot more richly priced on a valuation basis than the rest of the market, they've always gone on to underperform for a really long time. So please don't have more than half of your assets in passive vehicles like S&P index funds or target date funds or any of those things. You know, it doesn't matter what active strategies you pursue. You can do anything that makes sense to you. You could buy Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway. You can pick your own stocks. Just do anything that's a little different so that you're actually diversified.
Sounds great. And I take it that's sort of a non-negotiable, right? Trying not to do it. Do you have any other non-negotiables that help ensure financial security?
Write a will. It's so easy. Less than half of people do this. You can go LegalZoom. If you don't want to hire a high-priced attorney because you don't have a complicated estate, just write a will.
Absolutely.
And also, you know, do something that's a down payment on your legacy. I talk about this in the book too. You know, you can record an oral history. You could do videos. You could do a memoir. There's a cool service called Storyworth that helps people when they're retired put together a memoir for their loved ones. One of my clients did this and it was awesome. But just remember that, you know, your assets can play a role even when you're not here someday. So take all those things into account, especially when you have the time to do so.
And I love that you've got these buckets where, like, often people with finance, it's just about the money, just about right now, what can I get? And I love that you consider lifestyle and all of those other elements that make us who we are. Now, you talk fast like I do. So I go, for our listeners, you guys got double the value here today because you probably got an hour's worth of content in half the time. So go back and re-listen to the episode. This has been fabulous, Michael. And I normally like to end by asking, what's one of the greatest mindset shifts that you've had in your life? Not even about finance. It doesn't have to be, it can be, but just one of those aha moments that make you think differently.
When I realized that financial planning is not just about numbers, but also about getting the right narrative.
Yeah.
That's something that I came to that on my own because I was in a financial pickle where I had bills to pay, I had financial pressure, and I looked at a spreadsheet and it told me to go get another job. And then I talked to my wife about how I would regret that for the rest of my life if I went and did that. And I decided to favor my story over any of my short-term financial stress. Taking a step back in your income is really scary. It's hard to do. We're programmed to always want to feel like we're happy when we're in forward motion. One of the sayings in the book is that, you know, sharks have been on this planet for longer than most species. And one of the interesting things about them is they would die if they're not swimming forward. They can't breathe. Okay. They can only breathe when they're swimming forward. And our psychology is similar. So sometimes it's hard to take a step back in your income in the pursuit of a longer term goal. But if that's the story you want to write, then have the courage to write it. And never let anybody tell you different. That's a mind shift that I struggled with, but I'm so glad that I came to that conclusion.
You've got great metaphors, by the way. I love you've just been dropping some fabulous metaphors that make this so easy to remember. So where can people learn more about you, Michael?
Sure. Our corporate website, silverlight.us, or you could follow me on Forbes. I've written for them since 2017. Those are two good ways.
Yeah, and make sure to grab Michael's book as well. It's got lots of amazing gems there and some concrete stuff, almost like a little mini workbook that you can work your way through to be able to ensure your financial stability. So thanks so much for sharing with us today. You've given so much value.
Oh, great to hear. Thanks. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
And for our listeners, I have no doubt you got lots of value. I hope, like I say, feel free. This is one of those episodes that you're probably going to want to listen to periodically. So tag it, mark it, allow yourself to listen to it again as you hit different stages, and remind yourself about how to stay on track, right? And how to make your life a story that works for you. I think it's such beautiful advice. And give the gift of sharing, as always. Subscribe if you haven't done that yet, and share this episode with other people in your life so that they can start flipping their story to get more out of their life. And before we sign off today, just want to share some ways we can work together. I believe all of life is a negotiation. And if you are looking to up-level your negotiation skill to have your best life, I've got everything from online to group to my signature VIP and mastermind. If that sounds interesting to you, check it out at artoffemininenegotiation.com. And speaking of books, if you haven't got my book yet, please make sure grab a copy of Art of Feminine Negotiation so you can start negotiating your best life. And that is a wrap for this episode. Until next time, you go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so you can stop missing out and you can start getting more of what you want and deserve from the boardroom to the bedroom. Until next time, take care.